Thank you. I want to start. I'm not going to make a thank you, but I wanted to say that I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to thank you for responsible for me being here. I've been I was nominated student internship in Nelson Mandela professorship just before COVID hit. So I didn't make it then. Professor Sally Martin was the chair. Was the chair, and now, of course, we are on the new directorship in the department, and I want to thank also Snohazi for making this thing possible today. I want to thank obviously all the people who made this possible today. And I don't know that there is actually a great honor for us of Nelson Mandela and the 10th anniversary of the Mandela Fellowship. And so I'm really grateful. I'm looking forward to a very interesting exchange tonight. I understand it's a bit tricky because I know that I'm speaking to a wider audience, but I'm also speaking to students, I'm speaking to faculty, and my respondent, which is also very interesting, are also people who are students at the school and major humanities, which actually is interesting. But I want to in advance beg you for forgive me because I'm going to teach at the level. And if I hope that if you don't get it today, for the students in the room, professors, but if you want to listen to it, I'm sure it's been recorded and you might. But I actually want to take this task seriously because I'm addressing students, faculty, myself, and all who are listening to today. I am obviously, as I said, I'm from Guinea, in West Africa. I teach at Cornell African Political Thought. And so in my discipline, I look at the African descended diaspora from wherever they are. And recently, I've actually been looking at a particular tradition among the African descended diaspora, which includes South Africa, of course, people in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the New World, and etc. And so what I'm going to talk about today is actually part of a book project. It involves a particular dimension of African political thought. In America, in the 1960s, African American students fought to create programs like the one where I am today, Africana Studies, because they thought, rightly, that the academy, as presently constituted, and the disciplines in particular, do not take our concerns, and I'm putting ours here in quotation mark, African diaspora, African people, and etc. seriously, and that we should create a space from which we actually look at those concerns seriously in the context of the academy. And the idea is that at some point, our discoveries in Africana will be a challenge to the institution, the disciplines themselves to change, and in the process change us. Because we are in the process of making knowledge, to expand knowledge, to give human beings that we all are here, to give us more resources to think through the problems that we are all facing today in the world. And so, I wanted to return to Rivonia today with you and tell you a story about the African descended diaspora, about disciplines, and about how we think about the world. Rivonia, obviously, I assume that you all know, I'm sure it's part of the curriculum here. But there's only a part of that, the speech that Mandela gave at Rivonia, there's only one part that interests me today. Because we are academics, so usually we take one part of the speech and we dig into it. And so I'm going to look into what that said, what Mandela said that day, in the last paragraph at Rivonia, where it said that during my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination and I have fought against Black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony with equal opportunities. It's an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if need be, it is an idea for which I'm prepared to die. Those lines, since Mandela came out of jail and was president and then obviously sadly had to leave us, as we all must eventually do, those lines have been examined by many people. And we all hear different things from the speech. The one that Americans, where I am, and in the UK where I go often, and in France, the part that they all take from it is that he said democratic and free South Africa. And that hits the core of liberalism, right? He wanted democratic and free South Africa. And for them, that is actually the most essential part, which is true. In fact, I am not going to stand here and dispute that Mandela really was fighting for a democratic and free South Africa. And those are liberal democratic principles, and they presume rule of law, impartial judiciary, and et cetera, et cetera. Those actually are good values, by the way, and I do not mean to dispense with them because we actually all need them, and I'm going to go back to that. But one need not be a hermeneutician. Hermeneutics is obviously a particular branch of the humanities that concerns itself with interpretation. One need not be a hermeneutician to know that Mandela also talks about justice, both directly at Rivonia and indirectly. So democratic and free society, when he said democratic and free society, there is actually an equal opportunity part. In America, as in the UK, as many places, we forget the equal opportunity part. And we assume that those are embedded in liberalism, and so that's, if you say liberal democracy and etc., and that suffices. Perhaps. There is also the assumption that when he says, I have fought against white domination, I have fought against Black domination, that Black domination is the opposite, that those two are parallel, and that they inherit from the same places. Of course, in anti-colonial struggle, people, I assume, when Mandela is talking free and democratic society, he's very mindful of certain liberal principles, like Americans like to say, tyranny of the majority. So obviously when you say Black domination, you imagine, at least in the minds of liberals around the world, we imagine that you're sparing the white minority share of the tyranny of the majority. So we have to go to rule of law and etc. But in anti-colonial traditions, when you say equal opportunity and fighting domination, when you talk about white domination, it actually comes with a whole lot of history of domination, of expropriation, of humiliation, of a lot of things. So one is not parallel to the other, and you cannot presume that equal opportunity simply means we go back to rule of law and etc. because that's not what that means. But I'm not here to lecture about what Mandela actually meant, because that's not why I'm here. But I just want to say that if you want to talk about those two forms of domination that are implied in the speech, that they are not actually, they're not inherent from the same place, it does not presume parallelism between the two, and that those are two distinct branches of speculation. Then we can talk about that. But I want to go to the one that actually upsets me personally, which is that Mandela said that he was willing to die, and that makes him a hero. And I want to talk today about being hero and legends, which is why my talk is titled that way, legends. Because the heroism and legend are two ways in which Black people are stripped of thought. Because a lot of our actions becomes exceptional for the people who do it. So Martin Luther King was exceptional. Mandela is exceptional. Patrice Lumumba is exceptional. And we can just go down the line. And I want to tell you something about that. And which is why I actually want to situate what I'm saying today about Mandela in a particular tradition, because that is actually what matters the most to me. Thomas Sankara, who was president of Burkina Faso, once was asked about this idea that some Africans are heroes. He was very contemptuous in his answer. He said that our obsession with heroes is a form of abdication. Because if we say somebody is a hero, only heroes can do some things. We cannot do them. Whereas Mandela is an ordinary man doing ordinary things. Everybody can say, I'm willing to die for this principle. There's nothing special in the water that he drank when he was born that allows him to say that. We can all do that. And so hero worshiping is a form of abdication. Because we don't want to do what they did, and so we say that's exceptional. And so I was going to start with, because I actually like Thomas Sankara's answer, that a lot of time we talk about heroism and heroes for things that ordinary people did, which is actually accessible to all of us, which is within our means, all of us. That is not to diss the old man, obviously. I recognize that as a hero. So that don't misunderstand what I'm saying here, right? But the other part is obviously that we have made Mandela legendary, right? He's a legend. Not only legends have two implications. One of them is something is spoken, something that was spoken that stands throughout the times, that's legend. And legend is also a person who does something exceptional, and we talk about legends. Legends too is tricky because it extracts somebody from their context and make it also exceptional. And you can tell that the exception of Mandela is what I'm working against today, because yes, what he said might be legends, he himself might be legendary, but what Mandela did is not, in the context of the African diaspora, is not actually exceptional, which is not to say that he is not exceptional. Because in the context, no. In the context in which he spoke, he was exceptional. But what he did was not exceptional. Those are two things. Two things can be true at the same time. Compassion and empathy and commitment, which is what is Mandela's speech. Compassion, empathy, and commitment are actually not new in our political struggles. I'll give you an example. In Central Africa, there's a little country called Chad. I say little, it's actually big in size, but it doesn't have too many people. In June 1940, when De Gaulle was in hiding in Britain, the governor of Chad was an African-descended man, Felix Eboué. And I told you I'm going to tell you a lot of things. In the end, you'll get the gist of what I'm saying. But I want to give you an impression. The impression is a didactic moment actually for us. And he called these guys who were veterans of World War I and asked them to help defend France. Felix Eboué, again, African-descended Caribbean, his deputy, Lapin, is a Frenchman, white, and Lapin tells him, why do you imagine these people want to defend France? Eboué said, wait and see. And in fact, those African veterans decided to defend France. And they rallied, they answered the call, and they were the first people in the French resistance. And so what happens later is what I want to talk about, because Pétain, who is the head of Vichy France, was actually astounded. And this is what he said, which is what I'm talking about, legends. He said, in 1918, we were victorious. In 1918, France was victorious, Africans rebelled. In 1940, France is defeated, Africans come to it to defend it. How could you explain that? The French resistance did not have an explanation for it, but Eboué did. Eboué said to Lapi that in Africa we have a particular kind of humanism that is still yet to be recognized by Europeans, which allows Africans, though colonized by the French, to realize that fascism is a great threat and to expect that at the end of the war, we'll have a new post-colonial order, l'après-colonialism. Le Pen said, no, there's no humanism in Africa. Humanism requires science and reason. How can they be humanists if they have no science and reason? Right? But science, the systematicity of thought, the idea that Africans do not possess it is actually obscene at some level. But all our curricula in Africa and elsewhere presume that humanism is something quintessentially European, and European brought it to Africa, as if the idea of the human did not exist for us, and what humans do to one another was exceptional to us. I was telling you about Chad to tell you about, again, in French curricula, if you enter French classes, they will say how legendary these Africans were to ride to the cause of France, and nobody assumes that there is a reason, there is thought behind why they would do that. And why we would do that, whether there was thought behind it, whether there was political rationality, and whether, in fact, they did that so that after the war, the world can be in a different place, which is, again, Mandela Rivonia speech, and I'm going to come to that. All right? So, what I'm going to say here is that, of course, there are very deep traditions in the African diaspora, which even Africans themselves, to which Africans themselves don't pay attention, because we segment the experience of Africans and Black people, even though for 4 centuries, the Black body in Europeans' economies of violence was the one to whom the public square was interdicted. The Black mind was the one that was occulted, and Black thought was the one that was the most feared. So, Black people everywhere, from slavery to colonialism, have undergone the same experiences, different forms of administration of that violence, different forms of exclusion, but exclusion nonetheless. Exclusion nonetheless. And that experience, you don't need to be a biologist today, you don't need to be in evolutionary biology, you don't need to be in psychology and etc. to know that the human body responds to time, to the economies of morality, to experiences, to all of those, that people actually who are distant from one another, who are subject to the same mechanism of governance, may actually have similar responses. And I think that that's what I want to tell you here. That to Mandela, obviously a judicial trial where he was sentenced at Rivonia, he was not speculating philosophically, but trials are pedagogical. And if somebody knows that judicial trial is pedagogical and has a didactic dimension, somebody who was thinking, Mandela was, but people were listening to him probably were not, somebody who was thinking might have asked themselves, where does that come from? How can a person who is about to go to jail say, I have fought against white domination, I have fought against black domination, and I'm willing to die to maintain that principle? If you want legends, I'll give you one. In the Black diaspora from Vanuatu, yes, in the Pacific there, Black people all the way to Africa, we actually know the expression of time. It comes in the legend of the black butterfly. And I can tell you that legend at some point if you want. Right? The black butterfly, the butterfly everybody overlooks in the forest, the butterfly that does not fly to the fire, the butterfly that ponders what happens after every season and therefore is able to predict every season. The black butterfly is the one that predicts seasons. So you don't have to be a philosopher in Vanuatu to know black butterfly. You don't have to be a philosopher in Guinea to know that. It means that Black people actually from their own condition are able to listen to what is happening to the forest and to see beyond it. That's my version of legend. But beyond legend, so we can construct legends about what Black people do. But I'm here to tell you about legends. I'm here to tell you about where that comes from. There's a Black American minister, philosopher, whose name is Alexander Cromwell. Alexander Cromwell actually made it to the Stanford encyclopedia of philosophy as one of the most enlightened Black people who ever existed. And of course, Du Bois, W.G. Du Bois, and a bunch of other people were in his academy. He created an academy for Black people so Black people can think the experience of Black people in the modern world. Cromwell wrote a lot of books, many, but 4 of his books were actually about Africa. And in those books, if you read them between the lines, there's an insight I had from reading his books, which is that the problem of the modern world resided in the temptation of the West to never be able to get out of a quandary, which he called partial public sympathy. Partial public sympathy happen when states in constitutional orders favor certain forms of production, certain sectors of society, certain races, and etc. over other people. It happens when we think about public liberties and public freedom in the public square. It has to do with all the stuff that we do to one another in the public square, which since the modern era or before it, in the West has always been predicated on partial public sympathies. They come in different guises. Sometimes we say Europeans have reason, those people don't have it. Sometimes we say there are no industry with what they can take other people's land because they make it productive and etc. But there's always a way, a place, a time when partiality has to sneak into the way we imagine our public institutions. And so what I'm telling you today is that Cromwell was talking in there, though centuries before Mandela even uttered it, he was speaking to a tradition among Black people. Because Black people, the African descended diaspora, has felt that to be one of the most intractable problems in all of the institutions conceived by the West in modern times, partial public sympathies. And Black people, yes, the ones whose tradition he's talking about, actually have fought against that. That we cannot survive ourselves in this world, especially in modern world. Now, if I expound on what he's saying, if you think about the modern world, we cannot survive if we have institutions built on partial public sympathies. Either we are all human or we are not, which is why Mandela can say, I fought against white domination, I fought against black domination. Though the dominations are not the same. I want to underscore that. All right? Partial public sympathies. What Mandela said when I said he was not exceptional, and I talked about Chadians, I am going to go from the 17th century in the African diaspora, and I'm going to give you a list, and then I'll go back to Mandela. In Palmares in Brazil, the first republic of the modern time was created. Yes, you are not taught that in school. If you go to Wikipedia, it lasted longer than the Soviet Union. It's called Palmares, freed slaves. The greatest state of Palmares. Palmares was built precisely on the idea of no partial public sympathies, which is that people who created Palmares gave equality to men, women, equality of spirituality, which meant that African religions and Christianity and Islam and Judaism were equal. Equality of access, etc., etc. And I can give you a long list. They actually had, to date, the form of constitution that no modern Western constitutional order has been able to match. In the 17th century, in 1609 in particular, freedmen, foreigners, and enslaved people understood enough that you could not build the world a republic, a democracy based on partial public sympathies. You couldn't do it on the basis of gender, you couldn't do it on the basis of race, you couldn't do it on the basis of free, foreigners, and enslaved, newly free, old free, as they used to call it then. You couldn't do it on that basis. You couldn't do it on the basis of religion. You either are all human or you are not. And so they made the choice of having a constitutional order that banned all of that. You don't trust me? Read it. You don't trust me? Go to the Ministry of Health in Brazil today. Because there, the Ministry of Health was trying to do a DNA of all the population group that lived in northeastern Brazil, and they went to kill Angolas. They actually want to take the blood of black people to know how many Indians go to be there, because those free African slaves were the first ones to enter the Native Americans. It was the only space in the modern world where Native Americans were equal to the people who created them. No partial public sympathies. In Haiti, after the revolution in Haiti, what did they say? A lot of people have misunderstood this, because Haitians after the revolution said we are all black. Of course, they were not all black. They were Germans, they were French, they were Spanish, there were a lot of people on the island, but they said we are all black. People have misunderstood it, but until you read the Constitution, because the Constitution tells us we are all black, people don't believe that's what they say. We are all black because the Constitution recognizes that everybody was Haitian. Nouveau libre, ancien libre. The newly freed and the formerly freed. Right? Everybody had to have free access to the resources of life. And so when they said we are all black, they were extending human generosity to the white among them. You are like us. We do not countenance partial public sympathies. What is owed to black people is owed to white among us. We are all black. Haiti. 1805. Right? That's also what you find, right, in Mandela, but I'm going to skip Mandela now and go to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr., 1963. And I just want to tell you that the endurance of this temptation to not allow partial public sympathies, to treat everybody as equal. Of course, it comes with burden, the responsibility of what I'm going to talk about in the end, but it comes, right? Martin Luther King also said, when he said free at last, Amanda, free at last, right? Free at last, he said that all children of God, just listen to the term, all children of God. Blacks, I'm listing, then he listed them, black men and women, white men and women, Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, Catholics, to be equal, to look to the day when the state, the United States government, will make it possible for all citizens to join hand in, skip that, I put that in there, to join hand in hand to sing the word of the old Negro spiritual, free at last. That Negro spiritual also stands against partial public sympathies. We are all the same, or we are not. No partial public sympathies. Now, obviously, there is a problem with having to tell people who are not accustomed to think of Africans as belonging to traditions. As I said, not all black people thought that. In fact, here I have to qualify that the idea, feeling the oppression, feeling the burden of time, feeling the exclusion, feeling all of those things that I talked about earlier, black people have had many choices. I'm talking to a particular traditions, not all of black people. I'm talking about a tradition to which Mandela belongs, to which Kilomolas belong, to which Haitians belong, to which those Chadians belong, etc. It is a tradition. There are multiple ones. I want to tell you what these are traditions. But the idea that black people should have traditions actually sometimes leave a lot of white academic colleagues befuddled, as if political action is possible without some form of rationality, and whether rationality is possible without thought. And if there's a thought behind what Mandela was doing, what thought was that? It's exactly what is at stake. He did not read Kant, obviously. Sorry. He didn't read Levinas. He didn't read Derrida. Thank God. Levinas, who was taught at UGC, how do you say? UCT and all of these big fancy universities we have in South Africa, and Derrida and Kant could not see public morality to the extent that Mandela saw. Then Kant, obviously, his anthropology, you know what, the reason of Kant has been debated back and forth. I'm going to give Kant a look. But I'm coming to Levinas. Levinas, Time and Infinity, wrote volumes about ethics, about how we conduct ourselves, about how we run ourselves. But Levinas could not see the Palestinian as his neighbor. partial public sympathies. They're always creeping. The anthropologist way Kant put race in his ideas of the sublime of reason and aesthetics. Derrida twice he said once, I talked about apartheid, is the most awful, wonderful writing he ever did in his entire life, and he was a genius. Because partial public sympathies are very, very, very embedded and trusted in Western political imaginary. It always finds its way through. And that is what Mandela and other people are fighting about. No partial public sympathies. If the world, and this is the point, compassion, empathy, if the world today wants to save itself, we actually have a duty to recover some of those ideas. Not because ideas that came before that are Western are not valid, because they are, and I was Western to my student in America. Keep the archives distance with the canons. The archives are good for you, the canons are not. Because the canons are somebody's extraction from the archives and giving you, bending it left and right, and to give you something that actually is manageable and coherent. If people who were standing before Mandela had understood what that gesture was, if we were educated enough in the world today to understand that black traditions, nobody would have imagined that Mandela is saying, I fought against white domination, meant that there would be map road in which white people would be oppressed. We are not, that tradition does not operate like that. But there's a certain reading of the rule of law that is actually about partial public sympathies on behalf of people who already had taken everything and then said, can we protect what people have? Private property, rule of law, and etc. And we can also debate that. The problem of liberalism is not that everything says about the need to give government by consent of the government, etc. is true. It's not. It is that every single one of those precursors of liberalism, beginning from Locke, he had already invested in the colony of Virginia before he started talking about protecting private property. Very convenient. You can take from somebody else, you can protect it by law. Right? And so I actually was introducing that tradition today, and I don't know what my friends here are going to say, but I have a lot to say about it, but I don't want to take your time because I don't know what kind of questions you ask. But I want to ask all to accept the notion that there were very, very profound thought that came from black people during liberation that we think are either legendary or exceptional, but are not. But African traditions hold very, very clear and strong views about ethics, about self-government, about what we owe one another, and responsibilities beyond. And that, this is now my way of fantasizing outside of my text, is abnegation. The idea, and this is how the tradition is summarized, the idea that no human being should want something that they would not imagine other people would want to have. If you imagine that you want to have something, you should entertain the possibility that somebody else might want it. Abnegation. You should be able to give up something so that other people can have that which you want. That idea that nobody from Columbus all the way to Martin Luther King, that nobody should want to have something that they would deny another human being. Abnegation is at the heart of that statement at Rivonia. No human being should want to have something that they will not want another human being to have, or that they would deny somebody else what they themselves would desire for themselves. Abnegation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to begin firstly just by acknowledging your lecture, Prof. I think that to unpack and to reorient oneself around information that is so reinforced in every sector of our society is quite a challenge. And we've come to know certain things about Madiba, and these things have been taught to us in school. They've been repeated by our political leaders. They are, shouted on the tops of buildings by international mainstream media and all these individuals that we, regard as holding ultimate and important truths. And for them, and subsequently for us, Madiba is the African legend. And I think it's just a commendable thing to even just come together and bring people in a space where they can unpack, where they can question the things that they've come to know and accept as fact. So thank you so much for that. It's an honor to even follow you right now. Okay, so I think I am compelled to firstly speak about the general idea that we're reading Mandela wrong, right? Which for me, what I've understood is the idea upon which the public lecture is. Since Mandela joined his first student lecture at Fort Hare to his speech in Rivonia, we have generally read Mandela in isolation. We have highlighted aspects of his personhood that can be identified as like legendary or unique. I mean, he was the man who was willing to die for ideals, right? And I think for me, when we think about it in terms of African tradition and culture, our societies have always been organized around collectivist ideals. These collectivist ideals, which first of all acknowledge the individual and sees them as a primary factor or aspect of our society, and which treat the pains and the tribulations of one as the direct concern of the collective. That's something that I myself have seen in my own culture and in other African cultures. And in my own language, there's actually a saying that embodies this. It goes, which basically means that where there are others, others who are well, others who are able to live a full life, you are home. And in South Africa, there's a similar sentiment. We all know Ubuntu, which utters that same sentiment. I am because you are, and we are because of others. And so there's clearly an African tradition that is rooted in relational being, And so I always wonder, why is it that we find it so surprising that individuals who grew up in African communities, who grew up practicing these African modalities of beings, would act in ways that, acknowledge the individuality or acknowledge the being of others. Like, it shouldn't be that surprising. It's something that our communities and our traditions are rooted in. And already in his first section of the Rivonia speech, Mandela speaks to this fact, right? And he tells us that his bravery and his actions are born out of the stories and the legends that he had heard while growing up about his forefather. He lists several names, and excuse me if I butcher the pronunciation, but he speaks about Ndingani, he speaks about Makana, he lists names like Hinsa, and he says that he had always hoped that he'd be given an opportunity, to continue the work of those who had come before him. And he really is an individual who was born from a culture that defended people and their dignity. And yet we still read him as an anomaly or a deviation from his own environment. I think that is a shortcoming in our reading of Mandela, or maybe a shortcoming in the way Mandela is taught. And so when Mandela declared that he was willing to die for these ideals of liberty and equality, he was simply acting in a manner that reflects his upbringing and his culture. And that's the culture that I connect and equate with this African humanism that you're speaking about. Okay. But not only that, I think that for me, again, the reason why a leader like Thomas Sankara would be able to see the danger of elevating leaders to the position of a hero is also the problem that when these individuals fail, in their leadership in one aspect or another, it is often understood as a personal failure. I mean, if you are a legend and you failed, the legend failed. So what was happening, And so when leaders across the continent, whether it's Robert Mugabe, whether it's from my own country, Nelson Mandela, who were once, not Nelson Mandela, excuse me, yes, who were once hailed as these heroes or great leaders or legends, they eventually came to be known as villains or at least anti-heroes, in the course of their leadership, in their course of governance. And then they are once again singled out as being unique in their failures, And I think there's a danger in evaluating leaders in isolation like that, as legends and then again as these individual failures or individual villains, because we don't include the structure and the structure of the environment in which they rule. And of course, this is not to absolve any leader from their shortcomings or their failures. We all know that sometimes people in power do things that do not look out for the best interests of the people. And that is also something that must be acknowledged. But I think that I bring this point up in order for us to acknowledge the fact that we need to widen the perspective from which we interrogate leadership in Africa. I think my final point is on the idea of the erasure of knowledge. The erasure of information, like the creation of the state of Humanism or the liberation of France by Chadian soldiers, or even something that I didn't know, that African countries were actually some of the first to acknowledge America's independence. The erasure of information like this has isolated us in the contemporary world from seeing the fact that Africa has a rich and expansive history of politics, of diplomacy, of egalitarian international relations. And today, a lot of the challenges that we're experiencing with democracy and leadership in Africa, for me personally, can be directly linked to this erasure and the isolation from what has actually happened before on and around this continent. And so I completely agree with your call to expand the traditions from which universities draw our pedagogies. Another point. On the idea of African leaders as legends, I think perhaps in our elevation of our leaders as legends, we have also exercised reason and thought. And I say this because historically, Black bodies and Black projects of political experimentation have been either suppressed or ignored or violently crushed down or just flat out completely erased from all of our knowledge. And so for me, one of the responses to the actions of people like Madiba and other African leaders who have been hailed as legends is to highlight and elevate their actions, perhaps as a way to empower and to encourage and inform other people that, hey, if Madiba could do it, why couldn't you do it? If someone who grew up in the Eastern Cape could do it, why can't you do it? If someone who grew up in the north of Namibia could do it, why can't I do it? So I think as much as it is true, and as you said, two things can be true at the same time, as much as it is true that this elevation is very much a shortcoming and leads to gaps in our thought and reason, I also think it's important to acknowledge what it has done for all of us. I myself, growing up, have been inspired by people like Thomas Sankara, like Kwame Nkrumah, like Nelson Mandela, and now I'm standing here. I think I have 2 questions for you. The first question, okay? So you have shared your thoughts on the decolonization of the university curriculum on several occasions. And in South Africa, decolonization is presented as the answer for some of the things that you've spoken about today, you know, the fragmentation of knowledge, our own isolation from non-Western traditions, and so forth. And I know you touched on it a bit earlier when you said that you tell your students that we should keep the archives and move away from the canons. But I just also wanted to know if you could expand a bit more on that and maybe share some ideas on how you think we could go about changing the way in which we teach philosophy and politics in the university to include these abandoned archives and traditions. Then my second question is about leadership, okay? Even though figures like Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi have famously warned against the dangers of a singular story, there's a singular story prevalent in South Africa today, and that is one of a corrupt political elite. I mean, even during the times of COVID, we had from the missing funds to just last month, the suspension of the public defender. It seems that from the time of Mandela, we have taken a nosedive in terms of political leadership. So I have another how question, and I just want to know, how do you suggest we read the current crises in leadership and governance today? And yes, thank you very much.
A bit of a tough act to follow. No, thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for the department for giving us this wonderful opportunity, and thank you to Naudika for that sort of synopsis that you gave us from. I was sitting down front here and reflecting on when I was in the car to some event, and I heard on the news that Madiba had passed away. And as a South African, you feel this weird feeling as if somebody that you've known, that you've grown up with, has passed away. And these feelings, they come back every time we sort of hold these memorials, at least for myself, they come back every time we hold these memorials. So there's this intense, really strong hold of the legend, right? That encapsulates us. We learn about, as Naudika was saying, Madiba from school. And for heaven's sakes, we're in the province of legend, right? The Eastern Cape is known as the province of legend. So there is this long sort of history that overshadows our upbringing in this country with regards to its liberation. And so this kind of brings me towards my questions that I have, Prof. The liberation movement is, I would almost say, awash with legends. You can think around names such as Robert Sobukwe, Chris Hani, Solomon Hlangu, Oliver Tambo. It goes on and on and on and on. And when you talk to young people today, and particularly about Madiba and his legacy, life and legacy, there's a deep sense of despondency that has crept in, a sort of cynicism about what his legacy means. So on the one hand, you have this almost peeling back of the legend and a closer introspection of the life and legacy of this almost saint-like figure in our history. And I want to know sort of your thoughts on this almost coming to terms with our leaders not living up to that saint-like ideal that we have of them. And then on the other hand, South Africans have a deep obsession with legend. We have this intense obsession with looking for current political leaders who will give us the silver bullet for our problems, who will rise above our current crises and lead us to the new dawn, you know. So I want to know what your thoughts are on these two sort of sides of the same coin. On the one hand, this peeling back of legend, but on the other hand, this intense move towards looking for another one. Who is our next legend? Who is the person who can lead our country forward? So those are my two sort of perspectives that I'd love to get some of your thoughts on. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much to Professor Kovagui and to our wonderful discussants for their very rich reflections and questions. Because of time, I want to invite just 3 questions or comments for Prof. We'll have one round, okay? Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you to Dane and Dr. Coe. It was really interesting. I just have one question. When we were talking about legends, we brought up a lot of figures throughout history. But one thing I noticed, Corinne also noticed, is the lack of the female presence when we speak about these legends and these heroes, especially in African liberation movements. Often the role of women is erased. And I mean, one example that comes to mind is while we love and respect Winnie Mandela, she is also often demonized or only seen in relation to her husband, her former husband. And I want to know what you think about this and how can we approach this sort of like erasure of the female body as a legend, and the fact that female bodies do sort of encapsulate and embody a certain amount of power that's untapped. So, thank you.
So I think it's we should take into consideration the context in which they are speaking. At that time, the political movements were banned. That resistance was humbling, and so when they all speak from context, then we should be able to isolate.
I'm going to take these 2 and then we'll give Prof a chance.
Thanks so much for that illuminating speech, Prof. And I'm kind of, as a historian, I'm kind of interested in the conversation about the canon and the archive, right? Because we know national archives are constructed by regimes, right? There's a regime of truth that is in power currently, the ANC regime, then there's the National Party regime, and they regulate what documents go to the archive, what documents get to them, what truths get to them. So what is the complicity, can we say, of the archive in itself in creating very specific narratives about legends, either gendered, racialized, class-wise, right? Because the archives are extremely problematic in themselves. So what is the relationship between, can I say, archiving and recreating, I guess, this new idea of the legend, when the archiving itself is quite complicit in what, it omits, what it doesn't omit, what it hides, what it illuminates? Yes.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you first of all for the lecture. It was great. It was beautiful. I don't think my question is going to be well articulated as everyone else's, but I wanted to ask, in terms of legends, how we view the ANC in its entirety as a legendary group because of its history, and I wonder if that's, I guess, the way a lot of people hold on to that view of them as being this legendary, powerful group that came in and took us to a new dawn. Is that, I think, sorry, how would we approach this now to try and remove that idea? Because I know this is like not individuals anymore. There's a whole group of people that we view, and it changes, but it's still the same party. How would we go about getting rid of that viewpoint of people as legends? Because I think that's how a lot of us hold on to things, and that makes a lot of things not change because we always want to see. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying now the reason why people don't want to change is because this is the group that brought us democracy. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've asked all us interesting questions. And I want to actually start, I'm not going to follow the order in which the questions were asked, but I want to start with the archives. Archives are problematic because archives have become institutions. When I say archives, this is what I mean. From Diogenes, for philosophers in the room, Greek, 5 centuries onward, every single Greek philosopher spent time in Africa, not just visit. After the Renaissance, the French claimed every single one of those as indeed in European tradition, though there were Greeks in Marseille, none of those philosophers set foot in Marseille. And you want to tell me that the Greeks were speaking to Europeans in formulating their ideas and that Africans are not to Greek thought. So I have no patience with the idea that the Greeks are in the European tradition, blah, 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 all that nonsense. Right? So when I talk about archive, I'm just talking about sui generis, it's broader, it's not, right? Because, and I'm going to say this quickly, we actually don't know sometimes that if you look at disciplines that we have, though this idea of archiving has now reached obviously philosophy, of which I'm speaking, but philosophy as a discipline, all the pre-17th century disciplines were predicated on a different principle of organizing of thinking humanity than the post-17th century disciplines. Philosophy, math, philology, linguistics, and etc. were predicated all on the one. After 17th century, geography, political theory, political economy, anthropology, the new history, all of them were predicated on for those who are in math, differentials, right? It's predicated on things not being the same and distributed differently. So we can have that. Actually, I'm very interested in reforming curricula and disciplines. So we can actually talk about that later, but I just want to say that I was using archives for, much more. And I want to talk about, and so that I want to talk to decolonization. The thing about decolonization today is that all these young people who are talking about decolonizing speak as if MSS had not existed. Homo, who I'm talking about here, 17th century had not existed. We have been struggling with archive institutions, the academy, for nearly Du Bois and etc. So it is not. So we think what I really, what scares me about this new decolonial movement is that they think if you get rid of Western ideas, we'll go back, we are fine. Right? That scares me a bit. I'm a bit skeptical. That's the other thing is that the idea they reject as Western, as a West African, are actually mine. When Sufi enlightenment in Abbasid era, when the Abbasid Empire collapsed, it was recreated in Andalusia at the time when the Moors were colonizing Spain. The Moors are African. That's where, if you are a philosopher in the room, Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and all of these philosophers, Jewish, Christian, and etc., it was one very good moment of fermentation, cross-fermentation between people who come from different faiths. And when that collapsed, after 1492, when the Moors were kicked out of Africa, they all moved to Timbuktu. The Timbuktu experiment is also connected to that. There has never been in the history of West Africa a moment where Greek thought, Greek philosophy has not come to Africa when Africans have influenced Greek philosophy, ever. The fact that the French claimed them doesn't make them wrong, it simply means the French were wrong because they read them in a very narrow way. I actually have better claim on Greek thought of certain era than Europeans, all of them. Right? So I'm trying, this is what, when we do the colonial thing and we think, right? And the other part is that my father taught me when I was 9 years old. My father, labor activist, taught me when I was 9 years old to never say les Français. Guinea was a French colony. He said, there is such a thing as La France. You can blame for all your woes, but not les Français. Because if you read Voltaire, Voltaire is not in the same tradition as De Gaulle. So we have to be careful because Europe too had its own different traditions within it. Which is why when I was talking about Mandela, I said I'm talking of a particular tradition, right? So when we say Europe as if it was all uniform and this is one tradition and no periodization, no nothing, it also scares me a bit. We have to actually follow. What is interesting, and which is what I hold, is that we are today, the whole world, planet, we are undergoing a crisis of morality, of legitimacy, of state, of institutions, and etc. That the thought systems, the institutions that brought us to that crisis of capital, of ecological catastrophe, and all those are not going to be the only ones to give us a solution to those. For God's sake, let's expand our archives and our horizons. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying we reject somebody because they are right and the other one is wrong. It's simply to say, can we expand on our horizons? All right? So that's what the decolonial response to that is. The leadership question is tricky. Africa is in a tricky position, but everybody has undergone that thing. That what we are undergoing actually now, which is that it's very difficult to come from under the shadow of the founding fathers. Sorry for the gender question earlier, I'm coming to that. The founding fathers, right? We imagine that the skills it takes to free people are the same that it takes to govern. They are not. I come to Guinea. Sekou Touré, a man of the people, came to the university one day and said to people, you know, what do you think we should be done? A young fellow who was shorter than me stood up and said, you know, we should thank all the people who led us to independence. And he said, because we thank them for their charisma, their ability to articulate our concerns, and et cetera, et cetera. But now we are actually talking about political economy, we are talking about law, we are talking about ethics. It's not the same thing. So just because you freed a bunch of people, because you were capable of mobilizing them, doesn't mean that you can be a good steward of the state, because the state is a machinery, it's an institution, right? And we just have to accept that. So if you think it's an ANC problem, then you have not looked at Guinea. If you think it's a Guinea problem, you have not looked at Congo. It's everywhere because we think that these people who liberated us are also going to be, it's not the same thing. And that's why I'm going to stop, because if I go any further, I'm going to get in trouble. Right? But it's not, basically. But the legend thing, I want to come to that. The problem with legend is that we are always looking for salvation, and we think somebody else is going to bring us to us. Right? And this is the thing. If we want legends, I'm going to offer another one because it's part of the book I'm writing. Bears Node was the one person who understood what the requirement of the Rivonia speech was for white people in South Africa. And it comes from his own Dutch tradition. William of Orange, when he declared the Dutch provinces free, he was declared an outlaw by King Philip. And he said, when you free yourself, outlawry is what you want. That's Dutch. Outlawry doesn't mean that you don't live by law. It doesn't mean that you don't believe that law should be the means of governing yourself. It simply means that the language of the given law is no longer adequate. You cannot free yourself if you keep all laws. You need a modicum of outlawry. I can give you a whole speech about prayer. That is what Mandela was requiring. That's what he wanted. What happened in South Africa, at least I can say comfortably, is that nobody of equal standing, a lot of young whites were in the Communist Party and all that stuff, people said it, but nobody of equal standing who had stakes in modeling South Africa understood that everybody had to do a form of abnegation. Everybody had to be willing to both give up something and stand ready to die for a new order. That's the thing. And they just said, oh, we are not going to go the Zimbabwe way, so we don't have to go, and that's fine. Right? That's crude. I know, I'm saying it very crudely, but basically that's what happened. But there were people, even in this land, who understood. Bears Node is one of them, and I can give a whole speech on that, because it's part of the whole thing. Because abnegation by some requires abnegation by others, which is what the Dutch, again, the Dutch, you know the Dutch? Yeah, William Orange, he said, to have a new order, you need a modicum of outlawry. You need to stand outside all laws. So rule of law is not the problem is the law. So I leave it at that because I'm told to cut it short. The thing about gender, the part where gender actually appears in this new book I'm writing is about quilombos. Right? Quilombolas were very clear that if the women didn't move, the men did not move. In fact, both the army and agriculture was spearheaded by women, and for good reason. But, and this I must insist, it's not that somebody told the women, as we all know in Africa, you have the ANC, you have the Youth League and the Women's League. No, it's not somebody who gave permission to women. It's not somebody who allows them to. It is that women claimed it and women did it, and the men heeded the idea that the women could actually show them the way. That's different, right? And so, yes, in our tradition too, that's part of the discussion, which is why I told you that Quilombola, the first thing was that the equality of gender. That's where they started actually, right? And so that is, you're right, that we forget Guinea, my country. Guinea is the one country in Africa that was liberated by women. The only person who's written a book about it is Elizabeth Schmidt. It's called Mobilizing the Masses. But it was the one country liberated by women. Sekou Touré's opponents called them divorced women, prostitute, and high school dropout. Those divorced women, prostitute, and high school dropout are the ones who saved us. Because the railroad strike that lasted, if you read something about both bit of wood, the story is there. The railroad strike that lasted only 3 months in every African country lasted more than almost nearly a year, right, in Guinea, because of what market women did. That's also a story to be told. But that is so. But the thing is that when this one went to do the research in Guinea, people will say, yes, the women are the ones who feed us. And she will say, but which women? She spent 2 years trying to track down those women who actually feed us, which is the erasure part. So yes, in our stories in Africa, we actually, it's not just to be kind to women. It is actually how life, the dynamics of life. It did not, right? No man had to give women the permission slip. Yeah. Finally, to be prepared to die. You know who said first, exactly in the same way as Mandela did? After this class, read Patrice Lumumba's letter to his wife before he was killed. He said he was willing to die for Congo. Almost exactly in the same way. He said that if he must give his life for a free Congo, he would. And they killed him. Last month, they just returned his tooth, the only part of his body that was left. But he did tell his wife in his letter to his wife that nobody can make him, his will, and his desire disappear. And you know what? They put him in acid, but his tooth survived. So you could not bury Lumumba. Right? So yes, I mean, we have to be willing to die for something, and we have to uphold that we have to have principles. But dying also, we should not take it literally. It's our commitment. No, but it's in the commitment. It's in the commitment. Okay? So if I have forgotten some questions, I'm very sorry. It's because it's getting late. I'm running out of time. But I really want to thank you, except I almost forgot corruption. Corruption, when we are in South Africa, because of the gap in wealth, is so scandalously wide, it appears shocking to the senses. But when I was talking about crisis of institutions worldwide, it is everywhere. Corruption, the state is an instrument that everybody, especially after the welfare state, data providence and etc., people have figured that what you have, if you can get the state, you make the state do partial public sympathy. You make the state do something for you. Trump is as corrupt as the rest of them here. Those conservatives in America put the judiciary, they put conservatives, they blocked Obama's nominee to put conservative reports, so conservatives can give them what they want, judges to abolish abortion, etc. You see, that's the way where we have to be able, at the intellectual level, at the level of analysis, to make a distinction between the principle of rule of law and how it's enacted. What we have in America is no longer rule of law. They actually deliberately perverted the idea of the judiciary to have a Supreme Court that is conservative. That is no longer about the law. That's about power. Everybody around the world today, in France, Sarkozy is going to spend some time in jail. You can just go around the world. The sister of the king of Spain, everybody. Because we have lost the original idea of what the state was about, has been lost through a lot of, there's historical reasons for that. But where we are today, everybody wants to capture the state to feed their own pocket and to help their friends. And that's not only a South Africa problem. And so when we think about it, we actually have to put ourselves in a global context, because there's something happening in the state, and we all have had vested interest to think about what the state is for, how to control it, to make it do the thing that we want it to do for us. Thank you.
Professor Miller, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. I'm Professor Miller from the Thabo Mbeki African School at Unisa, and I just wanted to share a comment based on ideas where the seed was grown here at Rhodes University amongst the women here. And it links to what Prof. Rivonia has been sharing with you. And perhaps I don't understand the argument, but the anti-legend gesture presented here perhaps overlooks that these people are and were not ordinary individuals. Patriarchal traditions rest on the historical fact of the legend, the African nationalist period on the continent, and we've got all the names, right? We have these individuals tower over the rest. So just picture Sandton Square, when you see that statue of Mandela, right? It towers, they loom large, but for good reason too. Their intellects loom large, their energies loom large, their capacities, and let us not forget their appetites, whether it's books, ideas, wine, or women. So it is this looming large that then helps to create the disconnect between the leader and the rest. And so the discussant asked, how do we disrupt the legacy of the legend? And my question that I pose to you, and which people like Ms. Dr. Knowles has been saying for a long time, and Sunny and all the women that have gone here before, does matriarchal leadership provide a different legacy for leadership? If our inclination as matriarchal leaders, if our disposition is for our bodies as matriarchal leaders to stay connected, whether as mothers, aunts, girlfriends, gay friends, our disposition is to share of ourselves, to disperse our power rather than accumulate our power the way our male legends have done. Is matriarchal leadership better disposed to disrupt the legacy of legends? There are different ways of being extraordinary. We now begin to use our bodies as an archive, the memory that resides within our cellular memory. And this is the new intellectual tradition that is being born as we speak, as we write. But it is based, like Wasa used to say, on a rotation and circular form of leadership. That means we do not loom large, but we are instead immersed. And so we do not lose our ordinariness, and we are anti-legends, even though we have all the extraordinary qualities of masculinity.
Thank you, Professor Miller, an anti-legend who is a legend. She is the founding co-chairperson of the Women's Academic Solidarity Association, WASA, which was founded here at Rhodes in 2004, when this institution turned 100 years old. And so a lot of us learned our ideas of leadership from matriarchs, such as Professor Darlene Miller. The closing point from my side, Prof, to appreciate what you have offered us. You reminded me of a lecture that the historian, Mama Tamsan Matisane, who lives in this town, gave a few years ago. It was 2018. And she was talking about what we lose in our disciplines when we do not teach figures such as Charlotte Maitake and figures such as Dio Soga. And the point she made about Soga is that Dio Soga is the writer, the author of a very popular hymn written over 150 years ago. It is called Liza Lisidingalako, honor thy promise. In those lines, it says, Lord my God, honor thy promise to all people, to all nations. Over 150 years ago, he still had that expansive vision, not only for Africans, but for everyone. What Tisani then says is that real archives, real canons live in the hearts of the people. No one in South Africa needs to be literate to know who Dio Soga is, because the real archive lives in the hearts of the people. So what you've given us here is that African wisdom, that blues sensibility, which we move, we recognize the tragedy that confronts us, but we still have the wisdom and the hope, the tragicomic hope that Cornel West talks about, to move forward and imagine this world that you talk about, where it's not only my humanity, but it's all our humanity. So thank you so much. Thank you to our third years, especially. The food is ready outside. Have a good night.
crises